Today we have some more actual history about the Creek War of 1813 and 1814, which was a smaller conflict within the War of 1812. The Shawnee leader Tecumseh had visited the Creek Nation in the years leading up to this war, and he encouraged a large group of Creek Indians, known as the Red Sticks, to prepare for war against the Anglo settlers. Today we will talk about the final battles of the war when Andrew Jackson came down from Tennessee and took his vengeance on the Creeks for the massacre at Fort Mims. We will be reading from this book, The Creek War of 1813 and 1814, by Henry S. Halbert and Timothy H. Ball. This book was published all the way back in 1895. So here is the final episode in our series on the Creek War, when Andrew Jackson brought a final end to the Creek Uprising. The War in the Indian Country. After the fall of Fort Mims, the feeling among the whites was, Fort Mims must be avenged. The tidings went up into Tennessee, and Andrew Jackson, with Middle and West Tennessee volunteers and militia, soon started for the Creek Country. General Jackson is reported to have said in regard to the Creek warriors, "Long shall they remember Fort Mims, in bitterness and in tears." The following is the Creek War paragraph in Venable School History of the United States, one of the best school histories which I have examined. In the year 1813, the South became the scene of Indian war. The Creeks of Alabama and Georgia had in August attacked Fort Mims, situated on the left bank of the Alabama River, and massacred nearly 400 persons of both sexes. The vengeance which followed was swift and bloody. General Andrew Jackson, the commander of the expedition against the Creeks, expressed himself as resolved to exterminate them. A large force of Southern militia, aided by Choctaw and Cherokee allies, carried havoc from village to village, and finally, having cooped up about 1,000 of the Creeks at Horseshoe Bend, on the Tallapoosa River, charged upon them with such effect as to kill or drown 600, and capture the rest. Nothing was left for the remnant of the broken nation but to sue for peace. Paragraph 189, page 153. It was considered needful also by those in the Mississippi Territory and in Georgia that active measures should be taken against the Creeks for their own self-protection. That the facts really warranted the action taken may be fairly questioned. It is to be feared that the American people in their treatment of Indians will have not a little for which to answer at the bar of the enlightened public sentiment of future generations. It is a historian's duty to give facts, and not to make pleas, but it may be added here that Colonel Hawkins, the government agent residing among the Creeks, did not think it certain that the counsels of the war party would finally prevail. His views probably influenced General Flournoy, who under date of August 10, 1813, wrote to General Claiborne, "Your wish to penetrate into the Indian country with a view of commencing the war does not meet my approbation, and I again repeat, our operations must be confined to defensive measures." Had General Flournoy's policy been strictly carried out, had there been no burnt corn and a different officer at Fort Mims, the probability is great that there would have been very little Creek War. Pickett speaks of Colonel Hawkins as being strangely benighted, but it is by no means certain that he was not correct in his forecast of events, for neither Colonel Hawkins nor the Indians could have anticipated the burnt corn engagement, which seems to have precipitated rather than checked the war upon the whites, nor the attack on Fort Mims terminating so unexpectedly as it did to both Indians and whites, which led to the destructive campaign now before us. Brewer says, and his language seems to be that of a candid, truthful historian, the savages highly incensed at the attack made on them at Burnt Corn, July 27, 1813, resolved to avenge themselves on the Tensaw and Tombigbee settlers. Thus he accounts for the attack on Fort Mims, and so it was one vengeance after another vengeance. But whatever might have been, the white settlers bordering on the Creek Nation thought it was time to strike a heavy blow. They saw strong reasons for action. 3 bodies of troops, therefore, it may be said 4, marched as speedily as possible in the circumstances into the Creek country. 1 was from the river settlements, Mississippi volunteers, 1 was from Georgia, and 2 from Tennessee. The Middle Tennessee troops met at their place of rendezvous on October 4th, and on October 7th General Jackson joined them at Fayetteville. Associated with Jackson was General Coffee, and leading the East Tennessee troops was General Koch, and with him General White. General John Floyd commanded the Georgians, and General Claiborne the Mississippians. Engagements. Number 1. Tallase or Tallase Town. This battle was fought on November 3, 1813, General Coffee with 900 Tennessee troops conducting the attack. From General Jackson's official report, November 4, 1813, Governor Blunt, Sir, we have retaliated for the destruction of Fort Mims. He reports 186 dead on the field, and about 80 prisoners, women and children. General Coffee says in his report made the same day that not one of the warriors escaped to carry the news, a circumstance unknown heretofore. Number 2. Battle of Talladega, November 9, 1813. In this Indian town were friendly Indians besieged by a force of hostile warriors, the strongest fact found to indicate any real war among the Creeks themselves. A noted chief had made his way out through the besiegers in the disguise of a hogskin and requested aid from the Tennessee troops. General Jackson was now at 10 Islands on the Coosa, which was about 13 miles above Talladega Creek. Talladega was about 30 miles below. At 10 Islands was built Fort Strother. Jackson himself, with some 1,200 infantry and 800 cavalry, marched to the relief of the friendly Creeks. The siege was raised. Perhaps 400 of the besiegers were slain. Under date of December 18, 1813, at 10 Islands, General Jackson wrote to General Claiborne a long letter, given in full in Claiborne's Mississippi, from which the following extracts are taken. Before this reaches you, you will have heard of our battle at Talladega. It was fought on the 9th of November and was indeed a severe blow to the enemy. It is impossible to tell with any precision the loss they sustained. We counted, however, 299 dead on the field, but this is known to fall considerably short of the number really killed. Could I have followed up that victory immediately, the Creek War before this had been terminated. But I was compelled by a double cause, the want of supplies and the want of cooperation from the East Tennessee troops, to return to this place. Near the close of the letter is this suggestive statement. It is not understood by the government that this war is to be confined to mere temporary incursions into the enemy's country. Such movements might distress them, but would produce none of those lasting and beneficial effects which are designed to be produced. Perhaps, too, there are ulterior objects not yet avowed, which may be within the contemplation of government. Before leaving Talladega, it may be stated that within were 154 warriors with their families, and 1,000 hostile Creeks without around them. But it was no Fort Mims. In all, it is said the Creeks had in the field in the war party 3,000 warriors, and in every engagement they fought with what the narrators call a religious frenzy. Perhaps it might as appropriately have been called Spartan valor. Weatherford had told the war chiefs, if we accept General Woodward's statements, that going to war with the whites would prove their ruin. The Cherokee interpreter had warned them that they would lose their lands. And now that the Americans were actually at war with them, perhaps they felt that the time had come for them to dare to do or to die. Number 3. The Hillaby Massacre. This deplorable action took place on November 18, 1813. A body of volunteers from East Tennessee had marched to the seat of war under Major General John Cocke. General White, with 1,000 men of General Cocke's division, marched to Turkeytown and there reported to General Jackson that he would receive his orders. General Jackson sent him to Fort Strother at 10 Islands. The Hillaby Indians had opened negotiations with General Jackson for terms of peace, offering to surrender. While these negotiations were pending and the Indians were waiting for a favorable answer from Jackson, and General White was on his march to Fort Strother, he received orders from General Cocke, which orders he chose to obey, to attack these Hillaby towns. He fell upon and destroyed the very town that had already proposed to surrender to General Jackson, the inhabitants of which were waiting for the return of their messenger, and had no thought that they would be attacked by Tennessee troops. It was a massacre and not a battle. We lost not a drop of blood, General White reported to General Cocke, and Brewer adds, and Fort Mims was again avenged. It was a fearful mistake made by General Cocke or General White, or by both. It is putting it too mildly to apply Tennyson's expression, somebody blundered, and it illustrates the danger of having in the same field two commanders, one not cooperating as Jackson wrote with the other. Pickett says that Jackson was generally considered the commander-in-chief of all the troops from Tennessee, and the trusting Hillabys could look to no other. The surviving Hillabys could not learn that the attack was not made by his order, and as one result, in the succeeding engagements, they fought with a vindictive fierceness. They considered that the attack made on their town, in the circumstances, was an outrage, and when they fought afterwards, blood was shed. Number 4. Battle of Talle, November 29, 1813. Talle was on the south bank of the Tallapoosa, near the mouth of Calabi Creek, 18 miles from the Hickory Ground, and 20 miles above the junction with the Coosa. The Hickory Ground named above was a large Indian town, one of the residence places of General McGillivray. The noted Tocobachi was east from the Hickory Ground on the Tallapoosa. General Floyd, with 950 Georgia militia and 400 friendly Indians, among them the chief Mad Dog, and the friendly Tocobachis, made the attack on Talle. The Indians were driven out, about 200 were killed, the town was set on fire, and some 400 houses burned, some of them being fine specimens of Indian architecture. At the same time, or about the same time, Tallase was also destroyed. Little Tallase, called the Apple Grove, was on the east bank of the Coosa, 5 miles above the Hickory Ground. It was the birthplace of McGillivray. After destroying these towns, the Georgia troops returned to Fort Mitchell. Number 5. Battle of the Holy Ground, December 23, 1813. This action, as belonging especially to the Mississippi Territory conflicts, has already been fully described. Number 6, January 22, 1814, about 6 in the morning, near Amukfow Creek. General Jackson, with 900 men and 200 Cherokees and Creeks, marching southward, was attacked by 500 Indians. The fight lasted all day, both sides suffering severely, but the assailants were driven off. Jackson determined to return to Fort Strother. Number 7, January 24, 1814. Having reached a Hillaby village, Anitachapco, he was suddenly assailed with great vigor by the pursuing Indians. After an obstinate combat they were repelled, though the invading army was at one time in great peril. The Indians said, as their report of these engagements, "We whipped Captain Jackson and ran him to the Coosa River. He certainly fell back, and the Americans acknowledged that it was a severe engagement." Number 8, the Calabi Valley Fight, January 27, 1814. We return to the Georgia troops. Having his force increased to about 1,700 men, and with his 400 Indians, General Floyd moved into the Calabi Valley. And when about 7 miles from the present Tuskegee, the Indians suddenly sprang from their lair in the undergrowth of the creek, and made a furious assault about daylight. A charge soon drove them into the recesses of the swamp, with severe loss, but the cautious Floyd was effectually checked, and his campaign brought to a premature close. Says Brewer, from whom these statements are taken, the practical results of the fight were wholly with the brave natives. Number 9, Tohopeka, or the Battle of the Horseshoe, March 27, 1814. This was the great decisive battle. The place was a noted bend in the Tallapoosa River, which from its shape took the name of Horseshoe. Here 1,000 warriors made their final stand. It was fortified in the Indian style. If the breastworks were taken, it is supposed the warriors expected to cross the river and escape. When Jackson looked upon this chosen spot with its Muskogee defenses, he is reported to have said, "They have penned themselves up for slaughter." A flag of truce sent by him was fired upon. Whether through ignorance or design is not known. The Hillaby warriors might have been expected to fire upon it. The slaughter here when the action began was fearful. Not many of the 1,000 escaped. This battle may well be placed alongside that of the destruction that came upon the Pequods in New England. Of that, Martin says, "It was not a battle, it was a massacre." The well-informed reader will note more than one point of similarity between the old Pequod War and the Creek War. Perhaps the one was as needful as the other. The one blotted out a small tribe, the other subdued a great people. And Brewer says, "And the combined power of the whites, the Cherokees, Chickasaws, and Choctaws, assisted by a large portion of their own people, was required to subjugate them, and only then when the superior weapons of modern warfare had almost annihilated the fighting population. The following extracts from General Jackson's report are dated March 28, 1814. Battleground Bend of Tallapoosa, referring to the warriors. Expecting our approach, they had gathered in from Okfuskee, Okahoga, New Yorkow, Hillaby's, the Fish Pond, and Eufaulu towns, to the number, it is said, of 1,000. Determining to exterminate them, I detached General Coffee to cross the river, which was to cut off retreat. After describing the action and the little effect produced for some time upon the Indian defenses, having determined at last to take the place by storm, for which order the men were impatient, the report proceeds. The history of warfare, I think, furnishes few instances of a more brilliant attack. The enemy were completely routed. It is believed that not more than 20 have escaped. Before leaving Tohopeka, perhaps truth and justice require that another, a very unpleasant record should be made. It concerns the barbarity of some of Jackson's troops. Jackson himself, although determining to exterminate the 1,000 warriors, made in this war a good record for humanity in caring for the women and children, and in saving the life of a motherless Indian infant, when even the Indian mothers would give it no nourishment. But the same cannot be said of all his men. Mr. Warren Wilbanks of Noxubee County, Mississippi, who died in 1882, 90 years of age, is authority for the statement that many of the Tennessee soldiers cut long strips of skin from the bodies of the dead Indians, and with these made bridle reins. Also, that when the Horseshoe village was set on fire, some of the soldiers noticed a very old Indian, a non-combatant, sitting on the ground, pounding corn in a mortar, as though unaware of the tumult and danger around him, and that a Tennessee barbarian, though called a soldier, deliberately shot him dead, assigning as his reason for doing so that he might be able to report when he went home that he had killed an Indian. Mr. Archibald MacArthur, an aged man of Winston County, Mississippi, is authority for this statement that in the heat of the fight a lost, bewildered little Indian boy, 5 or 6 years of age, came among the soldiers when one of them struck him on the head and killed him with the butt of his musket. When reproached by an officer for barbarity in killing so young a child, he replied that the boy would have become an Indian some day. An aged man of Neshoba County, Mississippi, is authority for the statement that the party detailed to count the dead warriors found on the battlefield of Tohopeka, so as to make no mistake in the count, cut off the tip of each dead Indian's nose so soon as the count was made. They counted up, says Pickett, 557 warrior bodies found on the field. The Indians take off the scalps, these soldiers took off the nose. Surely it was not needful, in avenging Fort Mims, as it was called, that the whites should imitate the barbarity of the Creeks. It is claimed that the truly brave are nearly always humane, but many a sacked city and many a war-ravaged region can show that white soldiers may equal in atrocity and barbarity, and far exceed in licentiousness, the North American Indian. War at the best is ever terrible, and too many whites despise more or less what they call the inferior races of mankind. Only an Indian is a poor excuse for justifying a barbarity. At Fort Jackson, the old Tallase, the Treaty of Peace, by some called the Treaty of Conquest, was concluded August 9, 1814. By this treaty there was ceded to the United States government, to defray the expenses of the war, which of course the vanquished must pay, a large domain west of the Coosa, which was, says Brewer, a very important event in the annals of Alabama, for it threw open to the whites half the present area of the state. But although the treaty was signed by the leading chiefs and warriors, and thus it terminated formally the war on the Tallapoosa, which had been virtually terminated March 27th by that bloody battle on the Horseshoe Bend, many of the Indians fled to Pensacola. The British were permitted by the Spanish authorities to land some 300 men here August 25, 1814, and the British officers were permitted by these same authorities to equip and discipline these fugitive Creek warriors, that they might aid the British in an aggressive movement, which they planned against Mobile and New Orleans. General Jackson went down the Alabama to Mobile, reconstructed Fort Bowyer, which was attacked September 15th by a sea and land force from Pensacola. The land force mainly Indians, the sea force the British, but the fort was successfully defended. Then General Jackson, with about 4,000 men, marched across the strip of country lying between the cutoff of the Alabama and Pensacola, and captured Pensacola the 7th of November. leaving Major Blue to scour the coast and drive out the Indians from the swamps of the Escambia and the Choctawhattabee. He started back on the 9th of November for Fort Montgomery, a new fort a mile or two north of the destroyed Fort Mims, erected by Colonel Thomas H. Benton, who had command there in the fall of 1814, and went down the river to Mobile, and on the 21st he left Mobile for New Orleans. Major Blue, with a force of 1,000 men, successfully accomplished his dangerous work, so that as the year 1815 opened, a year that was to cover Jackson with glory at New Orleans, the last fighting for the time with these fierce Creek warriors was over. Thus was ended a war so glorious to the brave Muskogees, and yet so fatal. Their formidable strength was shorn forever. That neither Tohopeka nor the treaty at Tallase actually ended the Creek War is quite certain. Latour says that the Creek Indians had been defeated, and a treaty made, and he gives at its date August 10th, but he adds that a part of the Creeks refused to join in it, and remained still at war, committing depredations on the Alabama, Tombigbee, and Mobile Bay, aided and abetted by the Spaniards who supplied them with arms and ammunition. He says that General Jackson demanded satisfaction from the Spanish, and as this was not furnished, Jackson took Pensacola. When this was done, the war was soon closed. See Latour's Memoirs of the War in West Florida and Louisiana, 1816. Before the Treaty of Fort Jackson was signed, Big Warrior, in the name of the friendly chiefs, tendered to General Jackson and Colonel Hawkins a reservation of lands, 3 miles square for each, to be chosen by themselves, and to the two interpreters, George Mayfield and Alexander Cornell's, 1 square mile each. Colonel Hawkins, in a nominal acceptance of this gift, spoke of it as not originating in any intimation from themselves, but as a spontaneous act of the chiefs, as an expression of their respect for Jackson and himself. It is needless to say that by this kindly offer, General Jackson was not enriched. On the 17th of August, 1814, a Choctaw company of 53 warriors commanded by Pushmataha, with Mashalatabi as second in command, was mustered into the service of the United States. This company of Indian warriors formed part of the detachment under the command of Major Uriah Blue, and assisted in bringing the Creek War to a close. They were mustered out of service at Fort Stoddart, January 27, 1815. The record of the Choctaw warriors during the Creek War was in a high degree honorable. Their nation proved itself a true friend of the American government. Let us hope that posterity will never permit the name of their great and patriotic chieftain to pass into oblivion. It was stated in the introduction that the authors of this work proposed to do justice to the Indians and justice to the whites, which meant that they proposed and expected to state the facts, if they could reach them, concerning both the Indians and the whites, fairly, truly, without coloring, without unduly extenuating the blunders or the wrongs committed on either side, allowing only the ordinary and just feelings of a true humanity to influence them in any sympathy or feeling for the Indians, in any sympathy or feeling for the white settlers, holding themselves as impartial and friends to all, while following the white thread of truth, whether it should lead into the crowded stockade, or was found at the red man's campfire. All this, and it is much, they hope the readers will feel that they have accomplished with fair success. There is another line, another thread, the golden thread of even-handed justice, which they would like to trace by giving a brief summing up or review of this border war. Of course, every reader of mature judgment will do this for himself, but as we both have had many years of experience in life, and are no longer young, perhaps even such a reader would not object to take a look for a moment through our eyes. There are certainly some well-established facts. There had been some aggressions committed by the Creek Indians. The treaty preamble calls them numberless, a figure of speech, of course. A part of the Creek Confederacy proposed to make war upon the white settlers, perhaps hoping even to exterminate them. Some of the party went to Pensacola to obtain war supplies. They were quietly returning, and here comes, in the first real action of the war, the Burnt Corn attack. Woodward declares that the Indian leader Jim Boy said that the war had not fairly broke out, and that they never thought of being attacked. It was like saying if they had been civilized, true, we were getting ready for war, but no declaration of war had yet been made on either side. as they were not civilized and as the white settlers, not the United States authorities, considered it best to get the start of the Indians, they marched across their frontier line and issued their first declaration of war in the first discharge of their muskets and rifles at Burnt Corn. The whites commenced the actual open war. The next action, the first on the part of the Indians, but not the first of the war, was at Fort Mims. Brewer has surely stated the case fairly when he says, "A skirmish on Burnt Corn Creek, 8 miles below Belleville, in this county between the whites and Muskogees, July 27, 1813, was the commencement of the Great Indian War." After briefly detailing the action, he says that the Indians were greatly elated by their success. But he adds, inspired by revenge, a month later they fell upon Fort Mims. And if the facts teach anything, they surely show that the Indians, as being Indians, could do nothing less than take the fort and butcher the inmates. Nothing less when the commanding officer, on Claiborne's own testimony, held the Indians in contempt, and as a taunt and derision to the timid, had the main gate thrown open. The Indians could do nothing less without ceasing to be Indians than enter, kill, burn, and destroy. Now 2 questions arise here in this review, as we seek for the golden thread of justice. The first is, passing over what bloodshed there was in Clark County, why did not Weatherford with his victorious 1,000, if indeed they yet, as Pickett expressed it, thirsted for American blood, pass over the Alabama and fall upon the stockades of the real aggressive white settlers, who had put their cattle and put themselves on the Alabama hunting grounds? Why? Perhaps there were prudential reasons. It was not so easy for the Indians to take food along for a campaign of many days. It was not so easy for 1,000 men to cross the Alabama in a body, and then to recross it in haste, if they should need to retreat. And there were probably soldiers at Mount Vernon whom they probably did not wish to meet. But perhaps there were stronger reasons. They had learned something of the exaction of justice by the whites in the Meredith and Lot and Duck River tragedies, and now that they had, beyond their own expectation, contrary to the wish certainly of some, in one single day swept off 500, who could be classed mostly as Americans, they were perhaps startled as they looked forward to the results, as the chiefs, the leaders, those who knew the Americans best, looked back upon Fort Mims. It seems probable that they did not wish any further to incur the vengeance of the whites. They scarcely wished to engage in such another butchery. The question that comes up is this: September having passed and October having passed, and no great acts of hostility having been committed by the war party of the Creeks, was it really needful and was it fitting that such a destructive campaign, almost to the verge of extermination of the war party of the nation, should have been visited upon them in November and December, and January and March? Did the Fort Mims tragedy, provoked surely by the Burnt Corn action, justify that fearful retribution? And if, when the circumstances are considered, Fort Mims justified the shedding in return of so much Creek blood, was it justice to require such an amount of land from the Creeks to pay the expenses as claimed of that subjugating war? Alas, we do not find the golden thread of an even-handed justice. And what did Jackson mean in his letter to Claiborne by those ulterior objects, which he thought might be within the contemplation of government? There were land claims and conflicting claims there had been in the Mississippi Territory. Georgia had claimed, as granted by Charles II, King of England, all the land between the Savannah and the Mississippi rivers, and between latitude 31 and latitude 35. And this, so far as Charles was concerned, without regard to Indian rights. Congress bought at length the claim of Georgia for $1,250,000. Was the government looking forward to securing a more full title to some of this land? Since the first settlements on the Atlantic coast, it has been true that many of the whites have always wanted the Indian lands, their hunting grounds, even their burial places. They are wanting their very reservations now. Indian wars end in the extinction of Indian titles to land, and it may well be feared that this is an ulterior object underlying many of these wars. We reach now in our review, having already implied it and looked at it, the fact of the war waged against the Creeks, in which the larger part of their 3,000 hostile warriors seem to have perished, and the conclusion reached here is that the Creek War, as waged by the whites against the Creeks, was out of all fair proportion as compared to the Creek War as waged by the Creeks against the whites. Burnt Corn, Tallisahatchee, Talladega, the Hillaby Massacre, Atasi and Tallase, the Holy Ground, and Tohopeka outweigh the few aggressive acts committed by the Creeks before the war opened, the bloodshed in Clark, and Fort Mims. It was surely not all justice that influenced the movements of the armies of Jackson and Claiborne and Floyd. Well does Venable call it vengeance, and that swift and bloody. Well would it be if nations heeded more the meaning of the Bible statement, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." The remnants of the war party and the friendly Lower Creeks, after the Treaty of 1814, still held lands which were desired by the states of Georgia and Alabama, and in 1832 was ratified the Treaty of Cassetta, the first article of which states, "The Creek tribe of Indians cede to the United States all their land east of the Mississippi River. They were not obliged to remove by the terms of the treaty, but by the crowding in of the whites upon them, and in 1836, war actually commencing, they were constrained to remove to the west side of the Mississippi River." Here, in a part of what is known as the Indian Territory, they have found an abiding place, as nearly all of those among the Alabama pioneers who had any part in the events of 1813 and 1814 have passed away. So have the Creek warriors who passed over the Great Father of Waters pass now, all or nearly all over the viewless river which is to the white man and the red man alike, the end of strife and of earthly sorrow. The descendants of these Creek warriors have adopted largely the civilization and the religion of the American white race, and they now have farms and mills, and books and papers, and schools and churches. It is to be sincerely hoped that the American government will at length deal with them on the true principles of Christian equity, suffering no greedy white man to despoil them of their lands, and according to them at all times that protection to which they are so justly entitled. And those who dwell along the bright waters which once were held by the free and brave warriors of the great Creek nation should remember that the children of the forest and wild had the first and best right of all those beautiful streams, that the white pioneers had nearly always been aggressors upon Indian hunting grounds and burial places, and that the least they can do is, cherishing no animosity for provoked massacres committed in the past, to imitate such virtues as the Creek warriors did possess, and to do their part as American citizens in having henceforth just treatment accorded to all the remaining American Indians. So that's it for this episode, and this concludes our 7-part series on the Creek War of 1813 and 1814. At the end, the authors came to the conclusion that the Americans probably went too far in taking so much land from the Creeks as a result of this war. They noted that it may have been appropriate for the Creek warriors to pay for Fort Mims in blood, but that the taking of so much land in the treaty was not justified. At some point I may do a prequel to the Creek War about Tecumseh's visits to the southern Indian tribes to encourage them to go to war against the Americans. This led to some violent infighting within the tribes over whether to go to war. I skipped over Chapter 3 of this book, which is titled Tecumseh Among the Chickasaws and Choctaws, and Chapter 4 titled Tecumseh Among the Creeks. So if you are interested in those events, then you can read those 2 chapters from this book. This story mentioned General John Coffee. The legendary Texas Ranger John or Jack Coffee Hayes was named after General Coffee when he was born in 1817. Jack Hayes was the cousin of Mrs. Mary Coffee, the husband of the general. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that has been cast aside as unworthy and no longer shown on history channels on TV. But here on this channel we keep actual history alive by reading directly from old books. If you'd like to join our mission to keep actual history alive, then you can become a Patreon or YouTube channel member. Your contribution towards maintaining actual history, directly from old books, will be recognized at the end of each episode, and you will also have access to special members-only videos. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.